a lot of entrepreneurial spirits
Yeah.
will enter into business with all this flexibility and choice and opportunity, and then somebody says, and now you're big enough to have some structure, and every hair on their neck goes up.
Like, whoa.
So, whoa, this isn't what I signed up for. And I think particularly in business, emotion has been one of those things that's been sidelined as less relevant, when in actual fact it's a huge player. So if you're going to set up a business that's all targets, numbers, process, and relationship doesn't feature, then good luck to you.
Welcome to the first podcast of 2025. And our guest today is Yvonne Guerineau, who is an expert at creating relationships, positive relationships in the working environment and communication. So our conversation is going to be wide and varied, but particularly focused as we start the new year on how we can improve communication in our businesses and organisations. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, Yvonne, to the Evolve to Succeed podcast.
Hello, lovely to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So am I, especially. I'm a little bit nervous about this conversation because you are a relationship and a communication specialist. So I wonder whether you'll be analysing our conversation during the course of it.
Don't worry, I drove here thinking I was a bit nervous about it too, because we know each other.
Yeah.
And therefore, you don't know how it's going to go, whether it's going to be as structured as we might have wanted it to be, but I'm sure it'll all go beautifully.
It's going to be a great conversation. For our listeners, the focus is going to be around communication and relationships in the workplace, but really focusing as we start the new year on that communication piece. And I should probably start with that kind of question around why so often does communication break down in the workplace?
This is a really good question, actually. And I think about that a lot because in theory, I think it's always the same reason. It's a misunderstanding. But I think often the misunderstanding is the problem is that we think we've understood what's happening. So, if you and I are struggling to communicate, I might think I've understood what you want, and you might think you've understood what I want, but we've both misunderstood, but none of us are doing anything about it because we both think we know. So there's this whole void that is created by we all think we know what's happening, but we don't have half the puzzle pieces, but we formed a picture.
And is that because we're listening just for that piece of information that we want to hear?
Yeah, there's lots of things that go on. I think we listen for what we want to hear. We hear what we want to hear. We look for what we want out of the conversation and out of the interaction. We have our own agenda, not necessarily in a bad way, but we have our own reasons for being here and our own reasons for communicating the way we do. We have expectations. I have expectations of what I'd like you to think, what I'd like you to feel, what I'd like as a response from you. And that causes all kinds of emotional reactions if I don't get what I expect. Yeah. So all these things are playing out. And I think it's quite complicated how we communicate. And yet we all think it's quite simple. I say what I want and you say what you want and we're off. But it's not really like that. It's actually quite convoluted and complicated.
It is, isn't it? And there's this whole thing, isn't there, about when we are, and I suppose you've alluded to it there, Yvonne, in that piece around we make assumptions, don't we? And we have these unconscious biases in communication. And how much is that at play in failure in terms of communication?
I think it's massive. I think the assumptions we make are they're almost shortcuts for getting to a result as quickly as possible. So I might assume that you're pleased to see me because you're smiling.
Yeah. It's
often the right assumption to make, but it might not be. But we're making hundreds of those split-second decisions. People talk about this first impression thing, how you make this first impression within seconds, but we're doing it constantly. And there's all these shortcuts that we take as people, the way the brain processes information to make life easier. Because if you're constantly having to make decisions about every single little thing, you'd be exhausted and overwhelmed. So you come to the conclusion that if you're an accountant, you're this kind of person. If you drive this kind of car, you're this kind of person. If you move your face in this way, it means something. If you use certain vocabulary, it means something else. We have all these shortcuts. And there are lots of examples in psychology and the research that we have multiple different shortcuts all taking place at the same time to influence the way that we interact with each other. So there's all these things going on that we don't even realise are happening.
And I suppose that also comes into play with our own kind of history, backstory, experiences, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, because a lot of the things that we do are based on where we've been before. So when you're born, you're a bit of a clean slate. I mean, you have some basic things built in as human interaction, like, whether you cry when you need something or whether you're hungry, those things kick in automatically as a baby. Everything else is programming. Everything else happens by exposure. So what you see, what you hear, what you experience, it all builds these models in your mind of how the world plays out, how things work, what the rules are, who does what happens if they do it. All these things are programmed over time. So if you had an easy childhood that was fun and lighthearted, you might approach a relationship interaction quite differently to someone who had a really tough time, someone who was emotionally challenged, someone who didn't have a support network, someone who had a lot of fear that they had to overcome. So their coping mechanisms and their ways of interacting will be very different to yours. And most of us don't realise that that's not in the past. That's in the present.
It's still in here, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. All this is programmed into the system.
Yeah.
So when you hear a loud bang, you might go, oh, it's a car backfiring. I might go, oh, that's danger.
Yeah.
But we don't know that about each other because we don't have 30, 40, 50 years of history on people. But it's constantly turning up in everything we do.
So how important, if we're talking about communication in the workplace, is it to understand our work colleagues and who they are and what makes them tick?
I think it's hugely important. We're socialised animals. We benefit in terms of our health and well-being from being in good company, from enjoying the people we're around, from feeling supported, from having a social network. So the ability to interact with people and understand each other is fundamental to human health and happiness.
Yeah.
But it kind of has to start with you. So you have to understand yourself first, because it's hard work trying to understand other people if you don't understand yourself. So I think first and foremost, you have to invest in understanding the way you tick, the experiences you react to, the emotion that triggers you. All the things about yourself have to happen first. Then, yes, the next step is then to understand how that compares to what's going on with other
for a
people.
business leader and a business owner listening to this conversation,
it's terrifying because you have to understand yourself.
I'm sat there slightly more nervous than I was when I started the conversation.
You have to take an interest in who you are and where you come from.
How do you really do that?
How do you do that? I think you have to invest in taking an interest in yourself and why you do what you do.
Yeah.
Now, investing, that sounds like money. It doesn't need to be. It's about taking time to understand why you think that, why you do that, why you feel that, where that might come from, why you have that opinion. That's why coaching has taken off in the last 20, 30, however many years. It's because it encourages people to reflect on what they're thinking, what they're doing, how they're doing it. That's why so many leaders have coaches and mentors, for exactly that reason. So many leaders are probably already doing this.
Yeah.
If they're getting coaching, if they're getting, training from mentoring or from anywhere else, they're probably already doing this, but maybe they haven't applied it to relationship building specifically. Yeah. They might think they're doing it for their business. They might think they're doing it for their intellectual development, but probably a lot of that is transferable. So they don't need to rush out and find some new thing necessarily. But most of it's just about investing energy into saying, who am I? How do I show up? What effect am I having on people? Yeah. What happens around me? How do people react to me? Why do they react to me this way? Why do some people react to me this way and other people don't?
Yeah.
Who do I get on with? Why do I get on with them? Who brings up negative memories for me? Just spending time really thinking about who you are and how you are. That's part one.
Yeah.
Once you get the hang of that, then you can start looking around going, oh, interesting, that person isn't like me. How are they reacting? Why are they reacting? How can I influence that? How can I get other people to think about how they're impacting other people? Then it kind of comes out from you. But it's quite hard to teach and encourage other people around you to do things that you're not doing.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? And I suppose that comes down to how many of us who lead, run a team, own a business, recruit people like ourselves rather than that diverse team of different personalities.
Well, it's easier, isn't it, if you recognise what someone does?
What their triggers are, what makes them tick. Yeah.
Well, it's much easier to get on with someone who thinks like you, does like you, behaves like you. It's just easier, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas if you think, I've got to take on someone who's different to me, They might trigger me, they might challenge me, they might take me to places I'm not comfortable going. They might they can't make you, but they might encourage you to have to behave in ways that don't come as easily, don't come as naturally to you. So you're putting yourself out of your comfort zone in a way that people always talk about in business, put yourself out of your comfort zone. But with people, it feels that much more vulnerable, that much more triggering to have to behave to suit other styles and to suit other people.
And have you seen some examples, some case studies? I know you obviously clearly can't name names and that kind of thing, but some examples of where you've seen a leader, not adapt and what some of the issues created were, and where you've seen perhaps the leader adapt and seen the benefits within that business organization.
It's constant. I mean, this is happening all the time. Sometimes it doesn't cause any problems. Sometimes people around them can accommodate them. Surprise. So the leaders get away with it for years and years and years until someone challenges them. But it's different things. Like sometimes a leader will assume their approach is right. It's always worked for them. Then the business adapts. The business changes. Different people come in. Maybe they've bought a business and the culture is different. And now people want something else from them. And suddenly they're getting complaints, they're getting grievances, they're getting feedback that their style isn't working. They are hearing from other people that they are awkward. The feedback that used to be, you're so positive, isn't this great, suddenly doesn't work anymore. Or what often happens is when a business gets bigger, the things they used to get away with when they knew everyone,
I was just about to allude to that.
They can't get away with anymore because when you've got 100 people, you can't know them the way you knew them when you had 10. So when there were 10, everyone's forgiving because they know you, they understand you. Maybe they've got past your foibles and your quirks because they know you as a person. When you've got 100, they don't get to know you like that. So suddenly, what people used to say, oh, Warren's just like, that's fine. Now they go, oh, you seen what Warren does?
Yeah.
And now you're getting feedback that's probably always been there, but now you have to tackle it.
Yeah.
Because now it's affecting the way you do
that
things.
Big bit in a startup journey is that people are with you because they believe in you.
And they know
believe
you.
in that passion and they know you. I think that was the phrase you used just now that resonated with me. They know you. So they enjoy the passion, the energy, the way in which you communicate. They, in my own story, we did have lots of different personalities in those early days, but it worked. And it continued to work, but it did become more challenging once we went over, say, 10 to 15 people, because all of a sudden, your dominance, your presence isn't with the individuals. The relationships are still there, but they're not as strong.
Yep.
And therefore, I had to learn that actually how I communicated needed to change. We needed to communicate in different ways, in different mediums, and reinforce messages rather than just rely on this very close-knit team who got what I said and knew the nuances of what I meant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also don't forget that when you hire the first 5, you hire them. Yeah. By the time you're bigger, you're not the hiring manager anymore. No. So someone else has made that decision. So you haven't got that intimate relationship from the beginning. That person's bought into someone else, potentially. So the way that message came across at the recruitment stage has now been delivered by someone else in a different style. That person has bought into that message. So when you then deliver it as the next level up, for example, or in a different location in the organisation, that message isn't landing the same way and isn't heard the same way. And you said at the beginning about assumptions. This is it. This is the reality of the assumptions people make. So when they know you and they know you well and they see you every day at the startup phase, they make the assumption that he means well, that your intentions are good. But further down the line, someone you didn't recruit, someone who doesn't have intimate contact with you day to day, who doesn't know how you're thinking, they may not assume that you mean well, that your intentions are good, or that this is just a quirk of yours. They may start assuming that there's meaning behind that isn't there, or that your intentions are very different to what they really are because they've never seen that in action and they don't know how it plays out. And maybe because they're detached from you as well, hierarchically, depends on the organisation or by kind of geography or whatever, they may have other insecurities about how the relationship will play out in their future. So there's a bigger fear element to it, and we are not good with things that we're afraid of.
No.
So if we fear that you have power over our role, in a way that we can't influence, that changes how we might respond.
So it's an interesting dynamic for businesses and owners that
Yeah.
are listening that are perhaps going through that growth phase, is how do they become more consistent and how do they go through that transition? I think you probably started to allude to a few, but any hints and tips, Yvonne?
Consistency is a big one, especially if people have had difficult lives. And we won't go into it in any detail here, but if people have had difficult lives, consistency is important because they're more likely to get wobbled by not knowing what comes next.
Yeah.
That insecurity will be more likely triggered by them. So managers who are inconsistent are more likely to trigger concerns about intention and whether they are trustworthy. So consistency is quite a big one. And being explicit. And by that, I mean being very clear about what you mean. Anyone who's listening who has children will know that saying clear your room means different things to different people. In the same way
does
that
to my youngest.
completely, there's, clearing up can mean shove it in a drawer and hope for the best. And clear it up can mean put it all nicely on a shelf in alphabetical order.
Yeah.
If you're not clear about what exactly you mean, then interpretations will happen. And somewhere downstream, you will then notice how that plays out. So being really explicit is a big one. And that's just being clear what it is exactly that you want and how you want it, but also checking that that's landed.
Yeah.
So checking the person knew what you meant. As I said, practice on children and animals because you get very immediate feedback.
Yeah.
And if it's not clear to them, then chances are it's playing out the same way at work.
It's interesting, isn't it? You talk about that being explicit and consistency. I think for me, it was what I learned as we grew the business. And then as we stabilized and, we're that 40 people, was around that consistency point. So I knew that I could communicate well and I could get my messaging across, but I wasn't necessarily doing it often enough.
Okay.
So I had to and I'm not a very structured person, so I had to build routine into it. So we then did that, stand up Monday morning meeting thing just to keep everybody informed. We then did our more formal quarterly updates. And then, the general, so to give that structure to it, to make it consistent, which wasn't natural. And I can remember thinking for a period of time, well, why do people need this? But that's because of who I am. And I probably understood, and I was the leader, so I knew what was going on. But the consistencies for me was the biggest challenge.
What you've shared there is really interesting as well, because it does happen a lot. A lot of entrepreneurial spirits will enter into business with all this flexibility and choice and opportunity, and then somebody says, and now you're big enough to have some structure, and every hair on their neck goes up.
Like, whoa!
It's like, whoa, this isn't what I signed up for. Which is why you get serial entrepreneurs, right? They get to a point and then they have to do something else because they don't want to maintain something, they want to grow something. But most of these people have habits and routines, they just aren't applying it in the same way. So it's a bit like relationship people. People think you should have relationships naturally that are fluid and easy and it should be comfortable. But you can have relationship habits and routines like checking in with your team every morning or having email updates that remind you to ask someone how something is going. You can have structure built in. But a lot of people bristle at the idea of this consistency because it feels caged in. They feel trapped in this having to follow these processes and rules. What they don't realize is for other people, this provides safety and security and comfort, and they can trust that process more. So you have to think about what's serving you, but also what's serving other people. Definitely. I think this is the bit about having to start with yourself first. You do have to start with yourself first, but you also have to realize there comes a point when you can't serve yourself only as a leader. You have to serve the people around you too. And if you want the best out of them, you can't expect them to only play by your rules.
Definitely.
You have to also do what's for them. And this transition to structure, it doesn't have to be painful.
No.
It doesn't have to be mechanical and corporate for those who don't like that word, because it's quite triggering for a lot of people, the word corporate. It doesn't have to be soulless. It can be a routine that works for you, that feels good. Yeah,
so we found our rhythm and our way of doing it. It was probably the best, bringing some structure into it was the best thing we ever did.
And rhythm and routine doesn't have to be structure and caging.
It's still fun.
It can still be enjoyable.
But it took a while to find the fact that it could be fun and it could be engaging.
But that's your mindset. Do you remember we said at the
Yeah,
beginning about what goes through your
that's-
head?
yeah.
Yes. So if your idea of fun business and happy work
It's fluidity.
is being fluid,
Yeah.
then the minute someone says to you, and now we need some structure, all the doors shut,
Yeah.
you're like, well, that's not fun.
Yeah.
It's a bit like some people have this response that if relationships aren't enjoyable from the beginning, if we don't really hit it off from the start, then obviously it's not going to work. It's like, well, no, because that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
This person could be your best friend and a perfect work colleague for you or a great partnership, but immediate instinct didn't take you there. But maybe that's a trigger for you. Maybe they remind you of someone
Yeah.
and it's not the right reminder. You know, that person isn't this person. You've got to get past that. So in the same way that you have to ask yourself, am I resisting this structure because it's bad for the business? Or am I resisting this because I've got an issue here that I have to address about my relationship with structure and people and being told I have to turn up somewhere at 11 o'clock on a Monday? Yeah. You have to tackle yourself a little bit on that one.
Yeah, definitely. And the other one I've often seen there being some difficulties with is when an established organisation, business of any size, brings in someone new and senior into an organisation.
Yes.
Again, I suppose I use that hints and tips phrase, but we can probably understand from what you've said so far what would be going on in that environment.
Yes.
But what are the things people should be doing to make that work? Because again, in an owner-managed business, sometimes that's where the wheels can really come off.
I think the biggest mistake people make is they don't let people get to know this person.
Right.
The person will come in and say, I'm going to spend 30 days getting to know the organisation. If that means learning the processes and learning the rules and learning the customers and learning the product base, that's lovely. But it's not enough because you're not going to get the trust from the team unless you also invest in getting to know the people and they have to get to know you. So the sooner the leaders get into the organisation, they are seen, they are heard, people know what they're thinking and how they're thinking and where they came from and why they're here, and a bit something personal about them. Doesn't mean you have to share your life story, but something about why they're in this industry, why they came to this business, who they are, what their story is in terms of their career. They need to share something about themselves. People don't follow leaders enthusiastically when they don't know who they are or where they're going or where they've come from. People need to get to know that person. So if you're going to introduce a new senior person, you've got to realise that everyone underneath is going to wobble. Some of them might wobble for a second and go, oh, this is exciting, and run with it. Others might wobble and watch carefully for a lot longer before they decide whether this is safe, whether this person is someone they're going to like, whether this is someone they're going to trust. They may need a lot longer to get a sense of that consistency, to know how to operate with this person. So the sooner you can bring them together, the sooner they can get to know this person, the better.
Okay.
You need to take away the room for assumptions.
Right.
The more room you leave and avoid, the more people will fill it with their own version.
Yeah.
So
And we all do that in everyday life.
all
don't
the
we?
time. Yeah. I mean, if you don't know, just think road rage. Someone pulls out in front of you. There's no opportunity to clarify why that happened because two people in metal boxes on a road. Therefore, you will draw your own conclusions very quickly about why this person did what they did, how you feel about that.
Yeah.
So yes, there's not much room, and exactly the same thing happens in business. Think road rage. Think someone pulls out in traffic, new person pulls in to the car park. Everyone else is going, why do they do that? How did they do that? Why do they behave that way? Why are they saying that? And unless you say something, they will answer the question on your behalf.
A very quick break from this week's episode, which I hope you're enjoying. If you are enjoying, please remember, do help us and help yourself to make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing and reviewing the episode. So that's it. Short interlude from me. Let's get back to the conversation. I want to start to talk about you've written a book. So you're an author, and within that book, you talk about the safer principles in terms of communication.
Yeah.
And I just want to spend a bit of time during the course of this conversation to just explain perhaps what those principles are, what that model looks like, and how it applies in everyday life and the way in which we communicate. And I know we've covered some of those in the conversation so far.
Yeah, we've already touched on quite a lot of it. What I wanted to do when I wrote the book is give somebody a kind of skeleton structure to hang things on, because communication is such a huge topic and relationship building is such an enormous subject. You could overthink it massively and dig all kinds of holes for yourself. So what I want to do is create some structure, and SAFER is what I look at as the sort of component parts that you need to focus on if you want to understand what's playing out for you. So the S in SAFER is about stimulus. So it's about the triggers, the sensory experiences that might kick off a communication process. So that's everything from your smell in your office reminds me of growing up because it's the same coffee smell I had in my house, or if this room makes me feel uncomfortable. So the tiniest little sensory experiences that trigger for us, even things like the way you nod or don't nod and the way you look and what I see and what I hear and the sounds and the way you talk, whether I think we have anything in common because you sound like you come from the same part of the country as me or from the same part of the world as me. Any of these things are sensory triggers. Then you have the A of SAFER, which is attention. This is about priority management. So what catches my attention? Why does it catch my attention? Why am I giving this priority? The easiest way to think about this is there's something called the cocktail effect, cocktail party effect, where if you're in a crowded room and someone says your name, you hear it.
Okay, yep.
You are primed to hear your name. So if someone shouts 100 names across the room, nothing happens. Someone says your name, you're like a meerkat immediately. That's that effect. So certain things will get your attention the way other things don't. So to know what those are. But also things like what you choose to pay attention to. The reason things like mood boards and these goal setting things where you visualize things, the reason that works so well is because you're priming your attention to certain things. So if you decide you want a red Mini, they're everywhere. Minis are everywhere. You want an electric car, suddenly there's one parked on every corner because you're primed looking for these things.
And that's why, as you say, why those mood boards and
that's why they work so well.
Works, doesn't it? Because
completely
becomes in the forefront of your mind, as you say. It gets your
attention. Yeah, you're choosing to give it your attention. Yeah. Your brain says, "Oh, interesting. We're paying attention to this, are we?" Suddenly, it's everywhere. You're looking for it. You're grabbing those opportunities. You didn't realize those opportunities were there before because you weren't looking.
And how does that play out in terms of communication?
Well, if I'm paying attention to things you do that I think are likely to get me promoted, I'm going to be looking for that. Or if I'm paying attention, let's say somebody has said to me that you're a bit grumpy on a Monday. I'm now paying attention to what you're like on a Monday because I want to see what that looks like. Or I'm going to look out for it because I don't want to be on the receiving end of it because I've also heard what happens if I'm on the receiving end of grumpy you on a Monday. So immediately I'm primed. I'm looking for evidence. I'm paying attention. So you can choose what you pay attention to, but not always. Sometimes you don't know what you're paying attention to. So we're only into A.
Yeah.
Then F is about finding meaning. F is everything that goes on in your mind. It's your internal processing system. This is all the models from your past, all the history, and all the kind of psychological nuances of how your brain works. This is knowing things like the primacy and recency effect, for example, that you're more likely to be memorable if you're at the beginning of an interview process or at the end of an interview process because all the middle is blur. So you're more likely to remember the first thing somebody said and the last thing they said. This is why the first impressions works the way it does. Yeah. Things like halo and horns effect. I don't know if you've come across that.
Never heard of that.
Halos and horns is the idea that if I attach a halo to you and I decide you're my top performer in my business, you can do no wrong.
Okay.
Because you're wearing a halo. Someone else might have a horns effect, which means even if they did exactly what you do, I'm less likely to see it because I'm expecting something more negative. So let's say you're late. If you're wearing a halo, oh, poor Warren, he's late. Something must have happened.
He'll put in the hours later. Warren would never do that on purpose. He's very good at timekeeping. Yeah. If Horn's person is late, I'll be like, always late for everything, problematic. I bet he's made a mistake on that report. We immediately assume Horns will. So be careful that you have a top performer and you talk about your top performer, or the trouble person, that you talk about them as being trouble because you're basically setting up for more of the same. And there's something called a fundamental attribution error. These are all kind of things that you can look up. That's a really interesting one, which is that I'm more likely
to assume something you do is linked to your personality, I'm more likely to assume that something I do is linked to circumstances. So the reason you're grumpy on Monday, I'm making this up because I don't know what you're like on a Monday morning.
No, I'm all right on a Monday, actually.
Never seen you on a Monday morning.
It's a Wednesday, that's probably...
Oh, Wednesday. Okay, I'll make a note. But let's just say that you're grumpy on a Monday morning. Yeah. I'm more likely to think he's just a grumpy kind of guy.
Yeah.
Doesn't like Mondays. If I'm grumpy on Monday morning, it's because the child wouldn't leave the house and because the heating didn't come on and because the traffic was awful. And by the time I got there, obviously I was grumpy because circumstances led me there.
Okay.
So we're much more likely to do that with other people. So we could be careful with that. We're less likely to give them credit for their positive results, though. It reverses on positive things. It's more likely to be pronounced on negative things. So that all happens in finding meaning.
Yeah.
So all this internal working of your backstory, who you are, how you are, the way the brain naturally processes, all these things happen in there. Then in E, so we're on to safer. Yeah. The E is about emotion. This is about the emotional experience that you're having. In business, we often forget that we are emotional creatures. We think everything happens in the head. We process in the head. We're intellectualizing what we're doing. We're making decisions with the frontal lobe of our brain where all good decision-making gets made. We forget that we're also living emotionally. And in emotion, it's about an awareness of the way you emotionally react to situations. So that's all about what's happening in your body. Do you know when your heart rate goes up because you're anxious or excited? Do you know what happens inside your body when you're tense? Do you know what happiness even feels like in your body? What does anger feel like? How does it show up for you? How do nerves show up for you? How does joy show up for you? Our emotional vocabulary sits here. And that's quite important because when we're in the presence of other people, we're also emotionally engaging with other people, even if we don't realize we're doing it. We're somatic creatures, so soma is the body we experience in the body, so we can't pretend that emotion isn't relevant. And I think particularly in business, emotion has been one of those things that's been sidelined as less relevant, when in actual fact it's a huge player.
An immense player, isn't it? Particularly, again, in an owner-managed business environment, possibly more than the corporate.
Yeah, because you're emotionally invested in that business.
Because you're invested, emotionally. It's all in, isn't it? Those that are leading, owning that business, started that business.
Yeah.
You know.
And how hard is it for you if it's your business?
Yeah.
And there's someone in the organisation that doesn't appear to be emotionally invested.
Yeah.
That feels personal.
Yeah.
And then you're back into the mind games.
Yeah.
And the looking for paying attention to what they're doing and why they might be doing it. You know, all these things hang together. And then finally, you've got the R, which is response, which is where I would say the large proportion of people focus their attention when they're talking about relationship and communication. They focus on, what am I doing? How am I doing it? How am I saying that? How am I presenting myself? All this energy is in the R. When, isn't it incredible how much actually happens way before?
Happened up to that point.
Yeah, and if you read, I don't know if you've ever Viktor Frankl's book. He talks about between stimulus and response there is a space, and how all these things that I've talked about, the stimulus, the attention, the finding meaning, the emotion, all that is kind of coming in and playing out inside you. And then there's this space where you can then choose what you do about all of that. A lot of people don't realize that SAFE have all happened. They're so busy focusing on what they're going to do that they haven't thought about how they got there or why they want to do that, or that whatever they do is about to close the circuit and run back the other way.
And go again as another loop. Yeah.
Yes, because everything I say and do to you now triggers the same thing again. Does it get your attention? What are you seeing, hearing, feeling, experiencing? Yeah. What's the emotional response for you? What's playing out in your head as I say that? I mean, even as we're talking now, everything I say, every hand gesture, every intonation in my voice, it's all doing something. And what you don't realize as well is from a stimulus perspective, even the chair you're sitting in, are you comfortable? Are you not comfortable? What's the lighting like? Can you still feel your breakfast in your stomach? All these things are constantly running through you. So when I say something, your brain is processing all that. You're deciding whether you like this. You might be planning your next question wondering how to
Are
shut
you
her
really
up,
listening?
wondering whether
All
you
of
can
those
interrupt
things.
her now or not. All these things are happening.
It's interesting. And I can see how that, and you know, I suppose the R piece, the reaction piece, but the safe piece, I can see how it does play out when we're having a one-on-one communication.
Yeah.
And I think as you become more self-conscious and you understand yourself better, you do start to think about how's this conversation going to play out? What am I bringing to the party? What emotions am I bringing? What, you know, that finding meaning piece. What are my past histories? And you probably bring that to the table when you start to understand it. But that it becomes more difficult, doesn't it, when it's not one to one or one to few, when it's one to many, and those communication pieces. How does those principles, that model play out then, and how can a business owner, business leader sort of bring that into consideration when it's multiple people that they're communicating to?
I think what you've got to remember is when you're dealing with lots of people, you're still dealing with individual people. Every one of those people is an individual. So you basically just have to do it in a more complex way. Maybe give you an example is probably the easiest. So I run workshops. When I run a workshop, I have multiple people in the room. But every single one of those people is an interaction with me and is an interaction with each other. So when I'm watching the room, what I'm doing is I'm seeing who responds to who in what way. And then I have to work out, based on how they've responded to me, whether I have to pitch that differently for this person. And I get triggered sometimes by people in a workshop. And I have to very quickly be able to say, oh, interesting. I didn't like that, or that felt awkward, or that just triggered something for me, and I have to learn to switch it off. So as a leader in a group, you're basically doing exactly that, but you're just doing it on a more consistent basis. So you have to be an observer. You have to be very good at spotting what's happening for you, but also what's happening around you. So let's just say there's 3 people in the room. You've got 2 people with you. You say something, one of them smiles, one of them looks down and flicks their eyes across to the other. Now, there's a couple of things happening. You're thinking, well, why is that one listening and that one isn't? Or this is normal. I don't know what's playing out in your mind, but something's happening for you. But you have to be observing what they do and what happens next. So how have they responded to each other? What do they do? How do they do it? What do they say next? It's almost like you have to be a kind of detective spotting. And this is where the getting to know people thing is so important, because the more you observe, the more time you invest in watching people, observing, noticing how they behave and why they behave, the quicker you don't have to do it anymore, because you get it now.
Yeah.
You get to know them. You know what's normal. You can start to spot patterns. You get this in mental health conversations, don't you? They say, look for changes in behaviour.
Yes.
Well, first you have to know what the behaviour is. How do you spot changes?
Where's the baseline?
Yeah, you need some foundations to work with. If you never get to know the person, you don't know when their behaviour's changed. So you can't help them, can you, in that situation? So what a leader has to do is be an observer, has to notice what's normal, has to get to know people, not intimately every detail, but enough to know what's normal, enough to know what's a positive response, and enough to know what a less positive response looks like, to spend that time getting to know people individually. If you can't do that, because let's say you're into the hundreds, then you need managers who are going to do it. Yeah. And you need to be prepared to stand back and trust that they're doing it well.
And how do we develop, again, because as businesses grow, managers sometimes are promoted because they're the best at doing a role, not necessarily because of their people skills, that kind of thing. It all happens in life. And is
that really true? Does that really happen?
It certainly does. And in terms of then, how do you develop your managers to be better people managers and better communicators? Because to a certain extent, if you're the owner, the leader, you've probably got that growth mindset, haven't you? You want to become better. And I know that's what we all want in our managers.
Yes.
But sometimes you have to put structure around it to make it happen. So how can you make your managers in an organisation better communicators, to make them better managers?
Well, for a start, it helps if you model it.
Yeah. So
if you're investing in it, it helps. If you share that you're working on it, if you show them how to do it, because you're doing it, If you, let's say from the safer model perspective, if you're pointing out what you're picking up and what you're seeing and what you're hearing and what you're experiencing, if you're talking about your emotions and how you experience things, if you're telling them what you're interpreting and how you're interpreting it and why you're interpreting it, you're sending out the message that this is how things are done around here. This is how managers manage. So immediately you're role modeling that. So this is why starting with yourself is always a good place to begin.
Cascading down and coaching
and
down.
showing that, demonstrating that. But also it's the way you set the business up. Yeah. So if you're going to set up a business that's all targets, numbers, process, and relationship doesn't feature, then good luck to you. You know, you need results and relationship if you want this to work. They're not going to get it by accident unless they are naturally this way inclined. But it's a bit like in sales teams where people say, oh, they don't work as a team, but they're all individually incentivized and pitched against each other on a leaderboard. It's like, surprise. Yeah. So it's the same if you're in an organization. If you want managers to manage, you have to create the structure that allows them to do it. You've got to give them the time to have one-to-one conversations during their onboarding, induction, whatever you call it, when they first arrive. Are you giving them the space and the time to get to know people? You've got to say, have you got to know your people? You've got to ask them about their people as if they should know. You say to them, you know, how does the team feel about this? How are they going to react to this? You have to ask them questions that means they have to have a relationship mindset to be able to answer them. What reaction are you expecting from your team on this? What questions do you anticipate they're going to ask? Who do you think is going to struggle most with this change? What are we doing to support these people through this transition? They should be getting these questions from you as a leader so that they are thinking, I should be asking these questions. I should know this. My leader asks me this. I need to have the answers. And if I don't know how to get them, I'm going to have to ask for help. But it's okay because you're already sharing how to do that because you're role modeling it. So they can come to you and go, I'm not sure how to find this out from this person because this person doesn't open up. Or this person says this, but I'm not sure they mean that. And I'm not sure how to find out how to do that. Where can I get some support? What kind of training do I need? Am I missing something here?
Okay. It's good. That's a great response and a great answer. And I can see
And of course, it's easy in real life, yes.
Yeah, because we all have the time to do all of those conversations.
Absolutely.
All the time.
What you will find is you're going to need a lot more time if you don't have them.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you have to invest early because if you don't invest, you will get all the problems downstream. You know, I spent 20 years in HR before I specialised in this, and so much of the grievance and disciplinary and all the things that crossed my desk were things that could have been tackled earlier, and now they're a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you can avoid those things by doing everything right because life's not that fair, unfortunately. But there's a lot of things you could have got round had you invested earlier.
Definitely. And this whole piece around understanding others and getting to know others, and we've again alluded to it earlier in the conversation about how that's so much easier when somebody is more of a reflection of me. But it can be, you know, being really honest, it can be difficult, isn't it? When you're somebody that's perhaps outgoing and driven, and you've got somebody in the business that's analytical and thoughtful and considered, and, you know, there's just one example of a contrast. To actually get to know that person or understand that person. So again, I often say often asked it of you 2 or 3 times already, hints and tips about how do we get to know and understand others that are different to us.
I think first you have to have the mindset that they bring value.
Yeah.
I think if you assume that they bring some value and you're not seeing it yet, then you have to do some homework. Yeah. I find the easiest thing is to bring people together and make it part of the deal that you get to know each other. So to make time to bring the team together. It doesn't have to be complex, doesn't have to be a day out, doesn't have to be something expensive. It can be just putting them in a room together and doing something that takes you off the subject of work. And by that means something that, you know, conversation about hobbies, conversations about what we're interested in, conversations about how we mark certain occasions. Not everyone's going to be happy to share a lot.
Yeah, that's one of the difficulties, isn't it?
Yes.
You can get dominant voices in there, and those that are quieter, shy, the ones you want to bring out in a conversation like that are the ones that just hide away.
Well, don't let them hide. Yeah. So one of the things I do when I run workshops is if I know there's someone in the room who's quieter, I will often let others talk first, and then I will say to that one individual person, is there something you want to add? Often that person wanted to contribute, but they're not someone who's going to shout over other people. So you have to make it possible for them. You have to create the context.
Safer space.
You have to create the context. Or you have to say to the whole room, we're going to go around the room. We're going to go one at a time.
Yeah.
Now, that might be overly structural for some people, but for those who talk a lot, it will tell them that their turn will come, but they have to sit quietly and let everyone have their go. Yeah. So sometimes you have to be more structured. You might have to give everyone a chance to talk. You might have to create one-to-one time first with somebody so that you can bring them in and you know what they can contribute. It can be difficult doing things like people often say, we'll go down the pub and we'll talk. It's like, that's not necessarily the right environment for some people because they might not want to socialise that. But some people you have to get to know individually first before they open up in a group. So some introverts will want to get to know you in a smaller setting. Yeah. They won't open up in a large group, so you have to invest one-to-one. Some people will happily share who they are and how they are in a larger context. So with some people you have to go individual, some people you have to go bigger. Sometimes it's just the kind of questions that you ask. So to create an environment where people have to talk but away from subjects. Like sometimes it's just like putting a puzzle out on the table and saying, we're just going to talk about this in the format of a puzzle, or we're going to draw a picture. So instead of talking about how our week is going and doing a recap, you have to draw it as a stick person and you have to describe your drawing. You can find out a lot about somebody in the way they choose to describe something, the way they drew, why they drew it that way. And then what you do is you make someone give feedback on someone else's drawing. Yeah. So they have to find out from that person why they did it, how they did it, the way they did it, so they can feed it back. We learn a lot more about people if we know we have to pass it on. It's the same with reading books. If you read a book and you know you're going to have to talk about it, you read it differently because you read it thinking, how am I going to share that with somebody else? So if you give somebody the job of telling the room what the other person did and why they did it, they have to pay attention in a very different way to if it's just, we're having a chat. Yeah. So they will have to ask that question. But you can give them the questions to work with. You can tell them that they have to find out what they did in the holidays. Whatever it is. Yeah, but you need to do something. You need to actively encourage it because people will only choose to befriend the people they want to befriend, talk to the people they have to talk to. If there's only so much time, unless you say, get to know this person, they may not choose to do that. But that's natural, isn't it? There'll be, within any organisation, business, there'll be some close-knit relationships of people that are more similar to each other because that's natural. That's us as humans. Yeah. It's how do you develop that understanding and those relationships where there is trust throughout the organisation, which is the piece we're talking about, isn't it? But you can encourage people to befriend people who are not like them. So during induction, you can buddy them up with somebody who is their guide, who you know is quite different because you know they're going to give them a different perspective. When you work on a project, you can pair people up in projects that you know are very different, which forces them. Force, strong word, which encourages them. Well, no, it depends how you look at it, really. But they must. To achieve the result, they're going to have to work together. So you ensure that there's a need to get to know certain people. Often when I work one-to-one with leaders who are tackling this, I will say to them, befriend someone in the organisation you know is not like you. And it's not a fake thing, like to befriend them in a way that isn't true, but it's like go to somebody who knows not like you, get their take on it. So use them as a sounding board because then you know they're not like you. Whatever they're going to contribute, it's not going to be what you would have done because you're so different and you're expected to bring both of those things. So you need to find someone who's not like you and engage. Okay. And get them to believe. Yeah. And understand. But this, I've got a real example for me that I used to find it really difficult when people picked holes in something I was enthusiastic about. Don't we all? Well, no, apparently. Oh, okay. But that's where you and I are quite similar. So I would go to somebody and I would say, what do you think of this? Because they were quite senior. They had a lot of experience. I say, what do you think of this? And oh my God, the pain when they would go, well, you could do this and you could do this and you could improve this and you could do that. And I was like, all I wanted to hear was, wow, that's a good idea. Yeah. And immediately, like emotionally, that's quite a big reaction for me. But what I realised, of course, is this person is really good for me. Yeah. What they had to learn was to first say, that's a really great idea. Would you like my input to make it even make it work or make it better or make it land right? I'd be like, yeah, I'll have that because you like it. We're in a good place. What that person also realised is that I'm a really great person to come to when they have it all lined up, but they don't know how to get excited about it or how to get other people excited about it, because I can come up with that really easily. I can get excited about things. So this potentially is a conflict scenario. And in that particular relationship, it did start with me feeling quite uncomfortable with this person because I felt a bit threatened by the feedback I was going to get. But longer term, this became a really great dynamic because I go, oh yeah, this person will give me substance behind my enthusiasm, and they would be able to get some enthusiasm to help sell on their structure and their ideas. So sometimes you have to get over yourself. And this comes back to the very beginning of our conversation around knowing what plays out in your mind. Because if you think people like that are a nuisance, you will not get to know them. Yeah. Whereas if you think, oh, these people are a really great compliment to me, they will support my way of working, then you're much more likely to seek them out.
But it comes back to having the time and finding the time to invest
with yourself first, and how
and
you think and why
in the relationship.
So if you've got a conflict in your organisation, or someone comes to you as a leader with a conflict, the first question has got to be, why is this a conflict? What are we fighting for? What are we fighting about? What's the context here? What's my interpretation of what's going on here? Is it the person or is it the topic? Is it an emotional trigger in some way? You can work through this safer model and say, okay, what is it that they're doing, or what am I experiencing here? Why has this caught my eye or my attention in general? How am I managing this in my mind? What story am I telling myself about what's happening here? Yeah. Am I falling into any patterns that aren't serving me? What's my emotional reaction? Is this feeling excitement or is it tension? They can be very similar. Yeah. We've all had this, the nervous stomach that is the roller coaster effect of fun, but is also the sheer panic before something we're uncomfortable about. They're very similar. And then what am I going to do about that? But if you don't do the bit before, you don't get the benefit of getting the right response.
Okay.
So it's about taking yourself through that process.
Absolutely. As we start to wrap up the conversation, maybe we're at the start of 2025. Probably a time of year where a lot of business leaders, owners are sharing their plans, or they've come back post a sort of break and a recharge, bursting with energy and ideas. Your thoughts on how best a leader can share their future plans and their goals and their kind of ambitions for their business with say a team of 20 people?
So you've got 20 people, you've got to realise everyone's going to be different. So you want to capture not just what you want to impart, but maybe what they want to hear or need to hear. A lot of people will be nervous about their leader coming back with all these great projects and the more work, that they're about to inherit from this leader. So you have to think about how can you impart this enthusiasm, but also just like this example I just gave, what are the details that some people need to hear to feel okay about it? What reassurances do people need about what stays the same? What are the processes that are going to play out? It's all very well getting excited with new ideas, but how's that going to map out? What's the reality of that for people? How can they get involved? If someone wants to be involved, how do they get involved? What does it mean to me? How does this play out? Where can I ask questions? The biggest pain often as a leader, if you go out to your 20 people, is here's my great idea, and then the silence as the tumbleweed blows.
I learned that. And I had that. So the way I dealt with that,
yes,
I'm going to say it's right or wrong, I don't know, but I broke that down into, I used to, if it was, that's point of significance, we had that drumbeat of communication.
Yeah.
If it was that this is where we're going, this is where we're heading, this is the 3-year plan type stuff, I then post the announcement, broke it down into groups of, like, say it was a group of 20 to groups of 5, and just did, right, come and have a cup of coffee, let's have a chat. You ask the questions. Yes. And try to create an environment where everybody felt they could participate and ask and be challenging.
Well, like you said, in a group of people, some people will be the big voices and some people won't say anything. What, and you think you're going to speak up in a room of 20 when you've just announced some new information?
Yeah.
Of course they're not. So those people are not inclined to speak up. What people sometimes have expectations about is having this big brief, everyone getting all excited and rushing up to them going, aren't you genius?
Yeah.
Well done, I can't wait to get started. When exactly like you said, some people will need to take that in, process it, and find fault. in the arguments, find the flaws, find what won't work, what will work, what they like, what they don't like, how it affects them. So you have to create enough space for that to land. You are the stimulus.
Yeah.
You don't even know if you had their attention. You don't know what they're thinking about while they're sitting in this room. They might be thinking, is he going to announce redundancies? Is he going to announce redundancies? Is he going to announce redundancies?
Yeah.
When that didn't happen, that was all they had attention for that day.
That's all they heard.
That's all they heard is I'm safe for now. They didn't hear the rest, so that hasn't even landed. Then the finding meaning bit, you now have to get them to interpret all that. You knew it all before you even arrived. They didn't. This is news.
Well, that's that whole change management curve.
That's the change management curve.
Yeah.
It has landed for you long before it's landed for them.
You're into excitement and off we go, here's the plan.
Yes, for them, this is news.
Yeah.
So they're not going to get emotionally to the same place as you. So they're now going to have an emotional experience.
Yeah.
And they might only have the emotional experience based on what they paid attention to.
Yeah.
So you said 10 things. They paid attention to one of those. Their emotional reaction to that one is this. That's how they leave that conversation. The rest of it has to land before they can have a reaction to any of that, process all that. So yes, you have to create space for that to land, for that to get processed.
I suppose you need to therefore find a way of reaffirming the communication in some way, shape, or form, sharing a presentation, sharing an email.
So exactly like you said,
Yeah.
You might need group work, you might need individual, you might need someone they can talk to, you might need, if you've got a bigger organisation, a representative who goes around who gets the vibe.
Yeah.
There's always somebody who talks to everyone who will be able to get a feel for how that landed.
Yeah.
An insider who has their finger on all the pulses, who will be able to tell you how that landed, what did and what didn't, what you might reiterate in another way, what people didn't really understand but didn't want to say because they didn't want to look stupid. Yeah, you need to follow up. You can't announce and hope and disappear off thinking you've done your bit. You need to let it run through and give people space and time.
Brilliant, everyone. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Which is lucky when you were not sure how it was going to run.
So I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've gone silent on a few things you've said during the course of our conversation because my mind is whirring. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I know our listeners will take a lot away from that in terms of how they may communicate better on an individual or on a group basis within their businesses. If people want to know more about you, Yvonne, where can they go? Where can they get the information? How can they get a copy of the book? What was the book called? Oh, so the book is People in the Element, How to Create Positive Working Relationships. It's on Amazon, but you can come to me direct and get it as well. You can get it through my website, which is goldencatalyst.co.uk. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, although I'm more on LinkedIn than I am on Instagram. And I have a YouTube channel, so you can see some other things that I've posted up on my YouTube channel as well. So yeah, the website is the best place to start. And equally, if anyone had any thoughts out of this conversation, they want to throw questions my way, I'm more than happy to take questions because people often want to process things. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for your time and thank you for being a great guest on the Evolve to Succeed podcast.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. So I'm glad we both had that experience.
Good. I'm glad to hear it too. Thank you.
Bye.
So in the intro, I promised a wide-ranging and thoughtful conversation with Yvonne, and that's exactly what we had. So I hope you've enjoyed that conversation, our very first episode of the year. Do read Yvonne's book. It's a brilliant book, People in Their Element. You've got all the references that Yvonne gave you. And please do help us. If you've really enjoyed this episode and you want to make sure you don't miss an episode this year, then please do help us by liking, subscribing and reviewing the Evolve to Succeed podcast. Thank you.